Have you ever looked at someone and thought you had them all figured out? Have you ever dismissed a person because of their age, their quiet nature, or the gentle way they carry themselves, assuming their silence was weakness, and their kindness was an invitation to be used? We all do it. We build boxes for people and tuck them neatly inside, never imagining that the person we've labeled as fragile might just be a fortress in disguise. This is a story about one such fortress, and the family member who tried to tear it down, only to find herself trapped inside its walls. It's a story about a daughter-in-law who thought she was robbing a helpless old woman, but discovered something she never, ever expected. The world saw Eleanor Vance as a relic, a lovely, silver-haired woman in her late 70s, living out her quiet years in a sprawling suburban house that seemed too big for one person. Her movements were measured, her voice soft as worn velvet, and her eyes held a gentle, almost watery gaze that most people mistook for frailty. Her son, Michael, loved her dearly, visiting every Sunday with his wife, Clara. Michael saw his mother's strength, the quiet resilience that had carried her through widowhood and the solitude of aging. Clara, however, saw something entirely different. She saw assets. She saw a walking, breathing trust fund that was inconveniently still walking and breathing. Clara's smiles were as polished as the silverware she coveted, and her hugs were cold, calculating assessments of Eleanor's fading muscle tone. To Clara, Eleanor wasn't a person, she was an obstacle. An obstacle sitting on a prime piece of real estate, with a portfolio of investments that Clara felt was being wasted on birdseed and oversized print library books. "She's just letting it all sit there, Michael," Clara would complain on the drive home, her voice a sharp contrast to the placid music on the car radio. "We are struggling to make the down payment on the lake house, and your mother is probably using $100 bills as bookmarks," Michael would always defend his mother. "Clara, it's her money. She worked her whole life for it, alongside Dad. We have no right to it," but Clara didn't believe in rights, she believed in opportunities. And one evening, after a particularly frustrating visit where Eleanor had politely declined to invest in Clara's latest get-rich-quick scheme, an ugly idea began to fester in her mind. It was simple, really. Eleanor was old, slow, and trusting. The house had an old, outdated security system that Clara had already scoped out. What if someone broke in? A scare, a minor robbery. They wouldn't hurt her, of course. Just take enough to make a difference. Some jewelry, the cash she kept in the antique desk. If Eleanor was frightened enough, she might even decide to move into a smaller, more manageable assisted living facility, freeing up the house. It was a win-win, Clara told herself, justifying the darkness of her own thoughts. She knew a guy, Rick, a distant cousin of a friend who was always complaining about being broke, a man with a weak will and a desperate need for cash. He was perfect. Pliable. Forgettable. The plan was set for a Thursday night, the housekeeper's day off. Clara drove Rick to the edge of Eleanor's quiet, tree-lined street and gave him his instructions. "Go in through the back kitchen window. The latch is broken. She keeps a cash box in the top drawer of the desk in the study. And her jewelry box is on the dresser. Don't be long, don't make a mess, and don't touch her. Just get the things and go. She'll probably sleep right through it." Rick, his face pale under the streetlights, nodded nervously. He pulled his beanie down low, a man trying to hide from his own reflection. As he slipped into the shadows of Eleanor's manicured backyard, Clara felt a thrill of victory. It was so easy. She had completely, utterly figured Eleanor out. A few minutes later, Rick was inside. The house was silent, smelling faintly of lavender and old books. He moved like a ghost through the dark rooms, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He found the study, just as Clara had described. He slid open the top drawer of the old mahogany desk. And then, the room flooded with light. Rick froze, his hand hovering over a small, metal cash box. Standing in the doorway was Eleanor Vance. She wasn't screaming. She wasn't crying. She wore a simple silk robe, her silver hair neatly braided down her back. Her expression wasn't one of fear, but of profound, unnerving disappointment. "You must be Rick," she said, her voice as calm as a frozen lake. "Clara didn't tell me she was sending a guest." Rick's blood ran cold. How did she know his name? He stammered, backing away. I don't know what you're talking about, lady. Just give me the money and nobody gets hurt." Eleanor tilted her head, a gesture of mild curiosity. "Hurt? I doubt that very much. Clara's instructions were quite clear, I imagine. Don't touch her." She has a certain aversion to getting her own hands dirty. Rick was terrified now. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. The old woman was supposed to be asleep, or helpless. She was supposed to be a victim. But as he looked into her eyes, he saw they weren't watery or frail at all. They were sharp, clear, and they were fixed on him with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. The script had been flipped, and he was no longer the one in control. The silence in the room stretched, thick and heavy with unspoken threats. Rick, desperate to regain some semblance of power, took a step forward, trying to look menacing. "Look, just show me where the real valuables are." "The safe. Every house like this has a safe." He was bluffing, trying to reclaim the role of the aggressor, but his voice trembled. Eleanor didn't flinch. Instead, a faint, almost pitying smile touched her lips. "A safe? Of course. It's this way." She turned and began to walk down the hall, her slippers making no sound on the polished hardwood floors. Bewildered, Rick followed. This was wrong, all wrong. Victims didn't give guided tours. He glanced over his shoulder, half expecting Clara to burst in and tell him it was all a bizarre joke. But there was only silence. Eleanor led him to a small, unassuming library at the back of the house. The walls were lined with books from floor to ceiling. She stopped in front of a section dedicated to military history. "Clara has always been impatient," Eleanor said, her back to him as she ran a slender finger along the spines of the leather-bound volumes. "She sees the end result, but has no appreciation for the process. She wants the honey, but she's not willing to learn about the bees." She pressed a thick book titled The Art of Strategy, and a section of the bookshelf clicked softly and swung inward, revealing a sleek, black metal door with a digital keypad. Rick's eyes widened. This was it. This was the real prize. He shoved past her, his fear momentarily replaced by greed. "Open it," he demanded. Eleanor looked from the safe to his nervous, twitching face. "It's not locked with a code," she said calmly. "It's biometric. It requires a thumbprint." "My thumbprint." She stepped forward and placed her thumb on a small glass panel. There was a soft whirring sound, and with a heavy, satisfying thud, the bolts retracted. Rick grinned, a predator finally cornering his prey. He pushed the heavy door open and peered inside. It was not what he expected. There was no glittering pile of jewels, no stacks of cash. The space was small, about the size of a large closet, and lined with what looked like acoustic foam. The only thing inside was a single, plain wooden chair. It was a panic room. Before Rick could process what he was seeing, Eleanor spoke from behind him. Her voice had lost all its gentle, grandmotherly warmth. It was now cold, clipped, and full of an authority that sent a new wave of terror through him. "After you," she said. It wasn't a request. It was an order. He hesitated, a sudden, primal instinct screaming at him not to enter the dark space. But before he could react, another figure emerged from the shadows of the hallway. It was Clara. Her face was a mask of fury and impatience. "What is taking so long?" she hissed at Rick, then her eyes fell on the open vault. "Is that it? Get in there and get what you can." She shoved Rick hard from behind, propelling him into the small room. Then, eager to see the treasure for herself, she stepped in right behind him. The moment her foot crossed the threshold, a low hum filled the air. With a pneumatic hiss that was shockingly loud in the silent house, the heavy steel door began to swing shut. Clara spun around, her eyes wide with horror, but it was too late. The door closed with a final, booming clang that echoed with the chilling sound of absolute finality. A series of thick, steel bolts shot into place, their clicks sounding like coffin nails being hammered home. They were trapped. The single bulb inside the room flickered on, casting a stark, sterile light on their panicked faces. The walls were indeed soundproof foam. There was no handle on the inside of the door. There was only a small, grated speaker grill set into the steel. For a moment, there was only the sound of their own ragged breathing. Then, Eleanor's voice came through the speaker, devoid of all emotion. "Welcome, Clara. I'm so glad you could join the party. I trust the accommodations are to your liking." Clara lunged at the door, pounding on the thick steel with her fists. "Eleanor! Let us out! What is this? What are you doing? This is insane. You're a crazy old woman." The voice that replied was unrecognizable. It was the voice of a commander, not a grandmother. "Insane? No. Prepared. There is a difference. You saw an old woman, a house, and an opportunity. You failed to see the truth. You failed to see me. That has always been your problem." Rick had slumped onto the floor, his head in his hands, muttering to himself. But Clara was still fighting, her rage battling her terror. "My problem? You're the problem. Sitting on all this money, hoarding it while your own family struggles." "Struggles?" Eleanor's voice was laced with an icy irony. "You struggle to choose between a vacation in Bali or the south of France. You struggle to decide which luxury car to lease next. My late husband and I didn't work in high-level government security for 40 years so his son's wife could fund a life of frivolous entitlement." The words hit Clara like a physical blow. Government security. What was she talking about? "You were a librarian." Clara shrieked, her voice cracking. "You told me you were a librarian at the university." "That was my cover story, dear," Eleanor replied, a hint of weariness in her tone. "It was quite effective. People rarely look past a simple, boring label. They see what they want to see." You, more than anyone, the reality of her situation began to dawn on Clara, peeling away her anger to reveal the raw terror beneath. This wasn't her frail, doddery mother-in-law. This was someone else entirely. Someone who had built a prison in her own home. Someone who had anticipated every move. The room felt like it was shrinking, the air growing thick and heavy. Clara's breath came in ragged gasps. "Let us out of here, Eleanor. Please. I'm sorry. It was a mistake." "A stupid mistake." "It was not a mistake," the voice from the speaker corrected her calmly. "It was a choice. You chose to see me as weak. You chose to violate my home. You chose greed over family. And choices, Clara, have consequences. The police are on their way. I suggest you and your associate decide on a story. Although, I doubt it will do you much good. This room is equipped with a high-fidelity microphone and records everything. I have our entire conversation, starting from the moment you stepped inside." Clara stared at the speaker grill, her face ashen. "Recorded. Everything. Her threats, her confession, her greed, all laid bare. She had walked into a trap of her own making, sprung by the one person in the world she had believed to be utterly powerless." In the study, Eleanor sat in her favorite armchair, a cup of chamomile tea steaming gently in her hands. She looked the picture of serene old age. When the police arrived, 2 uniforms and a detective, they found her exactly like that. The detective, A sharp-eyed man in his 40s named Miller surveyed the scene with a practiced, weary gaze. You reported a break-in. Eleanor took a calm sip of her tea. Yes, detective. Although break-in is perhaps not the most accurate term. The perpetrators are secured. They are in the library. If you'll follow me, she led the stunned officers to the library, pressed the book, and spoke a clear command phrase into a nearly invisible microphone on the shelf. Initiate release protocol. Authorization, Vance, Eleanor, 1138. With another pneumatic hiss, the bolts on the panic room door retracted. The heavy door swung open, revealing Clara, tear-streaked and broken, and Rick, who looked like he was ready to confess to every crime in history just to get out of that room. Clara saw Detective Miller, and immediately launched into a new performance. Oh, thank God. Officer, you have to help us. She's insane. My mother-in-law, she trapped us in there. We came to check on her, and she lured us into that thing. Detective Miller looked from Clara's frantic, theatrical desperation to Eleanor's placid, almost regal composure. He looked at the high-tech panic room, a piece of equipment that belonged in a government embassy, not a suburban home. He looked at the trembling, sweaty man, who was clearly not just a concerned visitor. Something in the scene was profoundly wrong, and his instincts told him it wasn't the old woman. He held up a hand to silence Clara's tirade. He said, his voice level, addressing Eleanor. Why don't you start from the beginning? And so Eleanor did, her voice never wavering. She explained Clara's financial pressures, her veiled requests for money, and the events of the evening. When she was finished, she slid a small digital audio recorder across the library table to Miller. As I told my daughter-in-law, Eleanor said softly, the room records everything. I believe you'll find the conversation illuminating. Detective Miller's expression was unreadable as he took the recorder. He separated the parties, putting Rick and Clara in different patrol cars while he spoke to Eleanor alone. He was a man who had seen it all, or so he thought. He had dealt with domestic disputes, botched robberies, and elaborate lies. But he had never encountered anything quite like this. He listened to the first few minutes of the recording, Clara's angry voice, her demands, her admission of planning the whole thing. It was an open and shut case. But that wasn't what held his attention. It was Eleanor. The way she had controlled the situation, the chilling authority in her voice, the existence of a panic room that was more sophisticated than the one at the station. This woman was more than she appeared. Miller began, leaning forward slightly, his professional curiosity overriding his procedural duties for a moment. This room, this setup, it's not exactly standard for a residential property. Eleanor met his gaze, and for the first time, he saw a flicker of the life she had lived before this one. A spark of steel and shadow. My husband and I had careers that required a certain level of prudence, she said evasively. Old habits die hard. Miller nodded slowly, a new respect dawning in his eyes. He wasn't just talking to a victim. He was talking to a professional. The cynical gatekeeper in him, the part of him that processed crime with a detached, seen-it-all attitude, was being dismantled piece by piece. He was beginning to see the fortress, not the relic. Your daughter-in-law is claiming you entrapped her, he said, testing her. She's going to say you set this all up, that you're mentally unstable. Eleanor's smile was faint but sharp. She will certainly try. But the truth, detective, has a weight that lies cannot bear for long. Clara built her own cage, out of greed and disrespect. I merely provided the door. The weight of those words settled in the quiet library. This was not about a simple robbery. It was a collision of two worlds, the one Clara thought she ruled through manipulation and entitlement, and the one Eleanor had mastered through discipline, intelligence, and a lifetime of being underestimated. It was at that moment that the front door opened and Michael, Eleanor's son, rushed in, his face etched with worry. He had received a call from the police department and had driven over in a panic. Mom? Are you okay? They said there was a break-in. He rushed to her side, enveloping her in a hug. Eleanor returned the embrace, her posture softening slightly in the presence of her son. "I am perfectly fine, Michael." A little excitement, that's all. Then Michael saw the police cars outside, the grim-faced detective, and finally, through the window, he saw his wife, Clara, sitting in the back of a squad car, her face a storm of rage and tears. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. All of Clara's complaints, her schemes, her thinly veiled avarice. It all led here. "Oh no," he whispered, stepping back from his mother. "What did she do?" Detective Miller decided it was time to intervene. "Mr. Vance, your wife and an accomplice attempted to rob your mother tonight. Your mother, however, was more than prepared for them." He gestured vaguely toward the still-open door of the panic room. Michael stared at the bookshelf, at the hidden vault, at his calm, tea-sipping mother, and then back at his weeping wife in the police car. The woman he thought he knew, the life he thought he had, it was all unraveling before his eyes. I don't understand," he stammered, looking at his mother as if seeing her for the first time. "What is that room?" Eleanor reached out and placed a hand on his arm. It was a mother's touch, gentle and reassuring, but underneath it, Michael could now feel the unshakable strength he had always sensed but never truly understood. "It's just a room, Michael," she said softly. "A place to keep things safe." The most important things, the confrontation that followed was brutal in its quiet devastation. Miller played a portion of the recording for Michael, enough for him to hear Clara's own voice damning her. He heard her admit to planning the robbery. He heard her cold, calculating words about his own mother. The color drained from Michael's face. The woman he loved had tried to terrorize and steal from the woman who gave him life. It was a betrayal so profound it left him speechless, hollowed out. He walked outside and approached the patrol car. Clara saw him coming, and her expression shifted from rage to desperate pleading. "Michael. It's not what it looks like. She's crazy, she tricked me. You have to believe me." Michael looked at his wife, at the stranger staring back at him with frantic, lying eyes. And for the first time, he saw her the way his mother did. He saw the bottomless greed, the utter lack of empathy. "I heard the recording, Clara," he said, his voice flat, dead. "I heard you." The hope in Clara's eyes died, replaced by the cold, hard reality of her downfall. She had gambled everything on the assumption that Eleanor was weak, and that her husband was a fool. She had lost on both counts. Back inside, Detective Miller closed his notebook. The case was solid. Rick, the accomplice, had already given a full confession, eager to cooperate. Clara was facing multiple felony charges. Justice would be served, clean and simple. But as he looked at Eleanor, sitting beside her shattered son, he knew the legal outcome was only part of the story. He felt a need to say something more, to acknowledge what he had witnessed. "Mrs. Vance," he said, his tone formal, but filled with genuine respect. "In my 20 years on the force, I've dealt with hundreds of victims. But you are not a victim. You are, without a doubt, the most capable person I have ever had the privilege of meeting." Eleanor offered him a small, grateful smile. "Thank you, Detective. But capability is just a tool. It's what we choose to build or repair with it that defines us." Her gaze fell on Michael, whose face was a portrait of grief and confusion. She saw her son, caught in the wreckage of his wife's choices, and her heart ached for him. The fortress had protected itself, but her son was part of the landscape, and he was wounded. In that moment, Eleanor made a choice. She had spent a lifetime building walls, preparing for threats, and neutralizing dangers. Her every instinct was to follow through, to ensure Clara faced the full consequences of her actions. But looking at her son's pain, she realized that true strength wasn't just about defending oneself, it was also about knowing when to show mercy. It was about knowing how to rebuild. She turned to Detective Miller. Detective, she began, her voice regaining its softer, more familiar tone. I know what my daughter-in-law did was unforgivable. But my son is the true victim here. I don't want to press charges. Miller was taken aback. After all this? She conspired to commit a felony against you, and she will have to live with that, Eleanor said, her eyes fixed on Michael. Her marriage is over. Her life as she knows it is over. That is a prison of her own making. But I will not be the one to compound my son's suffering by putting his wife in a literal one. I will, however, be filing for a restraining order of the most permanent kind. Her consequences will be the loss of this family. That is enough. Detective Miller studied her for a long moment, seeing the immense strength it took to choose grace over retribution. He saw the strategist, the survivor, and now, the healer. He finally nodded. It's your call, Mrs. Vance. We'll document it as you wish. Clara was released, though her life was in ruins. Michael filed for divorce the next day. She lost her home, her husband, and the respect of everyone who learned the truth. She was left with nothing but the echoes of her own greed in an empty life. In the weeks that followed, the house on the quiet street began to change. The silence was now filled with more frequent visits from Michael, not out of duty, but out of a newfound desire to truly know his mother. He would sit in the library, and she would tell him stories, not of secret missions or government intrigue, but of the principles she lived by. She spoke of integrity, of preparation, of the quiet power of being underestimated. People always look for strength in the loud and the obvious, she told him one afternoon, pouring him a cup of tea. They look for muscles, for loud voices, for aggressive action. They rarely think to look for it in the quiet observer, in the patient planner, in the person who has learned that the greatest weapon you can possess is for your enemy to think you have none at all. And so, the story of the botched robbery became a quiet legend, a modern fable about the danger of assumptions. It serves as a powerful reminder that we should never judge a book by its cover, or a person by the quiet simplicity of their life. The most formidable fortresses are often disguised as gentle gardens, and the deepest strength is often hidden behind a kind and unassuming smile. What walls have you built around others, assuming you know who they are? True character isn't displayed in wealth or status, it's revealed in moments of pressure. It's in the quiet dignity of the underestimated, the grace of the wronged, and the courage to be a fortress when the world expects you to be fragile. Share this story with someone who needs to be reminded that their quiet strength is their greatest power. And comment below with a time you, or someone you know, proved that there was so much more to them than meets the eye. Never forget that within every person lies a story far more complex and incredible than you could ever imagine. Look closer. Listen better. And be prepared to be surprised.